In the suffocating heat of Cypress Hollow, Louisiana, a 78-year-old Navy veteran was about to face the kind of confrontation that had terrorized his community for years. What should have been a simple afternoon tea at Loretta's diner turned deadly serious when Deputy Rourke Maddox decided that imperfect parking warranted handcuffs and humiliation. Eli Booker wasn't your typical small-town senior citizen. For 4 years during Vietnam, he was a decorated Navy serviceman, known for his quiet dignity and unwavering moral compass that had guided him through decades of community service. When Deputy Maddox began his aggressive arrest of the elderly veteran for a parking violation, he had no idea he was being watched by a stranger who had spent decades mastering the art of protecting the innocent. Seagal executed a fluid takedown that would trigger a community awakening 20 years in the making. What began as routine police harassment would become a reckoning with systemic corruption. The bayou town of Cypress Hollow would never be the same after discovering that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up for what's right. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Louisiana bayou stretched endlessly in all directions from Cypress Hollow, Spanish moss draping the ancient oaks like funeral shrouds in the thick afternoon heat. The air hung heavy with moisture and unspoken truths, the kind of oppressive atmosphere that made honest folks keep their heads down and their mouths shut. At 3:30 on a Tuesday, the sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked pavement outside Loretta Mayfield's diner, the only place in town where the sweet tea was. Cold enough and the air conditioning worked well enough to make conversation bearable. Eli Booker eased his weathered Ford pickup into a parking space outside the diner, the suspension creaking in protest as he came to a stop. At 78, every movement required calculation and patience. The truck straddled the faded, yellow line between two parking spots not quite centered in either one. In a town where the parking lot stayed half empty most days, it shouldn't have mattered. Eli switched off the ignition, reached for his worn leather wallet on the dashboard, and slowly opened the driver's door. The heat hit him like a physical wall as he stepped out, his khaki pants and pressed blue shirt already beginning to stick to his skin despite the early hour. Eli had been coming to Loretta's for the better part of 2 decades, ever since his wife Martha had passed and cooking for one had lost all its appeal. The diner served as his social hour, his connection to a community that had grown quieter and more cautious with each passing year. "Afternoon, Mr. Eli," called Maya Tran from across the street, where she sat on the porch steps of the abandoned hardware store with her cousin Theo. The teenagers had their phones out, probably live streaming, or making TikToks as teenagers did. Maya was mixed Vietnamese and black. Theo was Mexican and white, and both had learned early that in Cypress Hollow, being different meant being careful. "Afternoon, children," Eli replied with a gentle wave, his voice carrying the soft rasp of age and a lifetime of unfiltered cigarettes he'd quit 20 years too late. He reached for his cane, a simple wooden stick he'd carved himself from a piece of cypress, and made his way toward the diner's front door. Inside Loretta's, the familiar sounds of small-town afternoon life hummed quietly. The coffee pot gurgled on its warmer, ceiling fans rotated lazily overhead, and the ancient air conditioner wheezed but held its ground against the Louisiana heat. Loretta herself stood behind the counter, a woman of 65 with silver hair, pulled back in a practical bun and hands that had served 10,000 plates of red beans and rice. She looked up as Eli entered, her face lighting up with genuine warmth. "Your usual table's waiting, honey," she said, nodding toward the corner booth by the window where Eli could watch the street and remember better days. "Curtis is already back there with his newspaper, grumbling about something or other." Curtis James sat hunched over a copy of the Baton Rouge Advocate, his mechanic's coveralls stained with honest grease and his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. Once upon a time, Curtis had been a journalist, covering corruption and small-town politics until the wrong story had gotten him blacklisted from every newsroom between New Orleans and Shreveport. Now he fixed engines and watched the world with the careful eyes of someone who'd learned that the truth could be a dangerous thing. "Eli," Curtis nodded as the older man settled into the booth across from him. "You see they're talking about raising property taxes again? Like folks around here got money to burn. Eli shook his head, accepting the glass of sweet tea that Loretta brought without being asked. Same old story, Curtis. Take from the folks who can't fight back. Give to the folks who don't need it. Through the window, both men could see Eli's slightly crooked parking job, the pickup truck's front bumper just kissing the yellow line. It was the kind of minor imperfection that would have gone unnoticed by anyone with common sense and basic human decency. Unfortunately, Deputy Rourke Maddox possessed neither. The white Crown Victoria police cruiser pulled into the lot fast, tires spitting gravel as it came to an abrupt stop behind Eli's truck. The engine continued running, the low rumble of the V8 announcing authority even before the door opened. Deputy Rourke Maddox emerged from the driver's seat with the swagger of a man who believed his badge made him untouchable. At 34, he carried himself like someone who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. His uniform crisp despite the heat, his gun belt loaded with enough equipment to outfit a small army. "Aw, hell," Curtis muttered, setting down his newspaper as Deputy Carla Vance stepped out of the passenger side. Vance was new, barely 6 months on the force, a former military police officer who'd come to Cypress Hollow looking for the quiet life she'd been promised. Her discomfort was visible even from inside the diner as she glanced around the nearly empty parking lot. Loretta moved to the window, her jaw tightening as she watched Rourke approach Eli's truck. She'd seen this dance before too many times, and it never ended well for the citizens of Cypress Hollow. Her fingers found her cell phone in her apron pocket, thumb hovering over the record button. Outside, Rourke's voice carried clearly through the humid air. "Sir, you're going to need to move that vehicle. You're illegally parked." Eli looked up from his position near the diner's entrance, confusion evident on his weathered face. "I'll be just a few minutes, Deputy. Just having some tea with—" "I don't think you heard me," Rourke interrupted, his voice rising with practiced authority. "That's a parking violation. You're taking up 2 spaces." The words hung in the thick air like a challenge. Inside the diner, conversations stopped. Across the street, Maya and Theo looked up from their phones, sensing the shift in atmosphere that preceded trouble in their small town. Even the cicadas seemed to quiet, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Deputy Vance shifted uncomfortably by the cruiser, her hand moving instinctively toward her radio. "Rourke," she said quietly, Maybe you should wait in the car," Rourke snapped without looking back, his attention focused entirely on Eli. The older man straightened as much as his back would allow, dignity holding him upright despite the growing humiliation. "Deputy, I apologize for the parking," Eli said, his voice steady despite the tremor that had begun in his hands. "My eyes aren't what they used to be. I'll move it right after." "I'm going to need to see some identification," Rourke said, stepping closer, deliberately invading the older man's personal space. The deputy's movements were calculated, designed to intimidate, to establish dominance where none was needed or justified. Inside the diner, Loretta's thumb pressed the record button. Curtis had moved to stand beside her, his journalist's instincts awakening after years of dormancy. Across the street, Maya and Theo had their phones up, live streaming to their handful of followers what was beginning to look like another example of Deputy Maddox's particular brand of justice. The afternoon heat pressed down on Cypress Hollow like a physical weight, but the real pressure was building in the space between a badge and an old man who just wanted some sweet tea and conversation. In a town that had learned to look away, to stay silent, to let injustice slide by like muddy bayou water, the moment of reckoning was approaching whether anyone was ready for it or not. The Spanish moss swayed in the humid breeze, and somewhere, in the distance, a motorcycle engine rumbled closer. The rumble of the motorcycle grew louder as it turned off Highway 90 and onto Main Street, the sound deep and steady like distant thunder. The bike was an old Harley-Davidson, black as midnight with chrome that caught the afternoon sun, and its rider sat with the relaxed posture of someone who'd covered many miles and seen too much of the world. Steven Seagal guided the motorcycle into the gravel lot beside Loretta's diner, the engine's rumble fading to silence as he switched off the ignition. He sat for a moment, taking in the scene before him with eyes that missed nothing. The confrontation between the deputy and the elderly man was escalating, the younger officer's body language screaming aggression while the older man simply stood with quiet dignity. Seagal had seen this dynamic play out in a dozen countries, in 100 small towns and forgotten corners of the world. The uniform changed, the language changed, but the abuse of power remained constant as gravity. Seagal dismounted the Harley, with fluid grace, his movements economical and purposeful. He wore black jeans, black boots, and a black t-shirt that had seen better days, his long dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. At first glance, he might have been just another drifter passing through Louisiana's bayou country, but there was something in his bearing that suggested depths beneath the surface. He moved like water, like shadow, like someone who understood that true strength rarely announced itself. The door chimes jingled softly as he entered the diner, the blessed coolness of air conditioning a relief after the oppressive heat outside. The establishment had that timeless quality of diners everywhere: red vinyl booths, checkered linoleum floors, and the lingering aroma of coffee that had been brewing since before dawn. But the usual comfortable atmosphere was charged with tension as every patron watched the drama unfolding outside. "Seat yourself, honey," Loretta called from behind the counter, though her attention remained fixed on the window where she continued, recording on her phone. "We got fresh pie if you're interested." Seagal chose a booth with a clear view of the parking lot, settling into the worn vinyl with the quiet presence of a man comfortable in his own skin. When Loretta approached with a menu, he looked up with eyes that were both gentle and unfathomably deep. "Just tea, please," he said, his voice carrying the hint of accent that spoke of many places and none. "Whatever kind you have is fine." Outside, the confrontation was intensifying. Deputy Rourke Maddox had moved closer to Eli, using his height and authority to intimidate the older man. The deputy's partner, Carla Vance, stood by their cruiser with obvious discomfort, her training warring with the sick feeling in her stomach as she watched her partner operate. "Hands on the vehicle," Rourke ordered, his voice carrying clearly through the diner's windows. "Spread your legs." Eli complied slowly, his arthritic joints protesting as he placed his weathered hands against the warm metal of his truck. The indignity was visible in every line of his body, but he submitted with the patience of someone who'd learned that resistance only made things worse. "This is wrong," Curtis muttered from his booth, his hands clenched into fists on the table. "The man's done nothing but park crooked in an empty lot." Loretta nodded grimly, her phone steady as she continued recording. "Been watching Rourke pull this garbage for years. Someone needs to finally put a stop to it." Across the street, Maya and Theo had their phones out as well, streaming live to their social media followers. Maya's voice carried a mixture of anger and resignation as she provided commentary. "This is Deputy Maddox harassing Mr. Eli again. Y'all remember what happened to the Henderson boy last month? Same deputy, same attitude." Inside the diner, Steven Seagal sipped his tea and watched with the focused attention of a predator, observing prey. But he was no ordinary predator. He was the kind that hunted those who preyed on the innocent. His eyes tracked every movement, catalogued every detail, assessed angles and distances with the automatic precision of someone whose survival had once depended on such calculations. Deputy Maddox's hands were rough as he patted down the elderly veteran, the search unnecessarily thorough and deliberately humiliating. "You got any weapons on you, old man? Any drugs? You better tell me now if you do." "No, sir," Eli replied quietly, his voice steady despite the degradation. "I'm just here for some tea." "Don't lie to me," Rourke snapped, his hands moving to Eli's back pockets with unnecessary force. "I can smell the alcohol on you from here." It was a lie, and everyone watching knew it. Eli Booker hadn't touched alcohol since his wife's funeral. 3 years ago, when grief had briefly driven him to seek comfort in a bottle of bourbon that had only made the pain worse. But truth had little relevance when Deputy Maddox was making a point. Carla Vance shifted her weight from foot to foot, her conscience battling with her desire to keep her job. She'd grown up in a military family where honor and duty meant something, where protecting the innocent was the highest calling. Watching her partner abuse an elderly veteran made her sick to her stomach, but she was still new, still on probation, still vulnerable to the whims of Sheriff Hank Maddox, Rourke's uncle, and the man who'd hired her. "Rourke," she called out, her voice carrying a note of warning. Maybe we should just issue a warning and move on. It's not like he was causing any real problems. Rourke didn't even look back at his partner. "When I want your opinion, Deputy Vance, I'll ask for it. Until then, keep your mouth shut and let me do my job." The words stung like a slap, and Carla's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. She'd taken an oath to serve and protect, not to stand by while citizens were humiliated for no reason other than one man's need to feel powerful. In the diner, Steven Seagal finished his tea and placed the cup gently on the saucer. The sound was soft, almost inaudible, but it seemed to cut through the tension like a blade. He reached into his pocket and left a $5 bill on the table, more than enough to cover the tea and a generous tip besides. "Trouble brewing out there," Curtis observed, watching as the stranger rose from his booth. Seagal nodded once, his expression unreadable. There's always trouble when good people stay silent too long. The door chimes rang again as he stepped. Outside, the wall of heat and humidity hitting him like a physical presence. But his focus was entirely on the scene before him, where Deputy Rourke Maddox was reaching for his handcuffs, while Eli Booker stood with quiet resignation against the side of his truck. The cicadas had resumed their chorus, the Spanish moss swayed in the humid breeze, and somewhere in the bayou an alligator slipped silently into dark water. But in the parking lot of Loretta's diner, the real predator was about to reveal himself, and the quiet balance of power in Cypress Hollow was about to shift forever. Maya looked up from her phone screen as the man in black approached the confrontation, her thumb hovering over the share button that would send the live stream to her growing audience. Something in the stranger's movement made her pause, made her zoom in closer. This wasn't just another bystander. This was someone who moved like trouble, like justice, like the answer to a prayer nobody had been brave enough to voice. The afternoon heat shimmered off the asphalt, and Deputy Rourke Maddox reached for Eli's wrist with rough hands, completely unaware that his world was about to change forever. Deputy Rourke Maddox's hands were rough as he grabbed Eli's wrist, the cold metal of the handcuffs glinting in the afternoon sun. The elderly veteran didn't resist, his dignity intact even as his body trembled slightly from the combination of age, heat, and the humiliation of being treated like a common criminal for the crime of imperfect parking. "You have the right to remain silent," Rourke began, his voice loud enough to ensure every witness could hear him assert his authority. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "Excuse me, Deputy," the voice cut through the humid air like a blade through silk, quiet, respectful, but carrying an undertone of authority that made everyone within earshot turn toward its source. Steven Seagal stood about 10 feet away, his hands visible and empty, his posture relaxed but somehow coiled with potential energy. He'd approached so quietly that neither deputy had noticed him until he spoke. Rourke looked up from the handcuffs, his face flushing with irritation at the interruption. "Sir, I need you to step back. This is police business." "I can see that," Seagal replied, his voice maintaining that same calm tone. "But I'm wondering what this gentleman did to warrant arrest. From where I was sitting, it looked like he just parked a little crooked. He's interfering with a police investigation," Rourke snapped, though everyone present could see there had been no investigation, just harassment escalating to arrest. "And now you're interfering too. Keep walking before you join him in handcuffs." Inside the diner, Loretta continued recording while Curtis leaned forward in his booth, recognizing something in the stranger's bearing that spoke of experience with violence and authority. Across the street, Maya and Theo had their phones trained on the unfolding confrontation, their social media followers growing by the minute as word spread through teenage networks that something was happening in sleepy Cypress Hollow. Deputy Carla Vance felt her stomach clench as she watched the situation escalate. Her training told her that her partner was way out of line, but her position as the newest member of the sheriff's department made her reluctant to intervene. She'd seen what happened to deputies who crossed the Maddox family. They found themselves transferred to the night shift, assigned to the worst details, or simply forced to resign. That man's done nothing wrong, Seagal said, taking a single step closer. His movement was fluid, economical, like water finding its path. He's a senior citizen who parked imperfectly in an empty lot. Hardly seems like grounds for arrest. Rourke's face darkened with rage. Nobody questioned him in his own town, especially not some drifter who'd probably just ridden in on that beat-up motorcycle. I said step back. Last warning. But instead of stepping back, Seagal moved forward another pace, closing the distance between them to about 6 feet. His hands remained visible and empty, his expression calm. But there was something in his eyes that made Rourke hesitate for just a moment. You know what your problem is, Deputy, Seagal said, his voice carrying that same quiet authority. You mistake fear for respect. People don't look away because they respect you. They look away because they're afraid of you. There's a difference. The words hit their target like a physical blow. Rourke had built his entire identity around the idea that his badge commanded respect, that the fear in people's eyes when he approached was a sign of his authority. Having that illusion stripped away by a stranger in front of half the town was more than his ego could handle. That's it, Rourke snarled, releasing Eli's wrist and turning toward Seagal. Hands behind your back. You're under arrest for interfering with a police officer. He lunged forward, reaching for Seagal's arm with the same aggressive movement he'd used on countless citizens over the years. But Steven Seagal was not a frightened teenager or an elderly veteran. He was a man who'd spent decades studying the art of violence, who understood leverage and momentum and the precise application of force. What happened next took less than 3 seconds but would be replayed on social media thousands of times over the coming days. As Rourke reached for him, Seagal simply wasn't there anymore. He'd moved to the side with liquid grace, his hand capturing the deputy's extended wrist and using the man's own momentum against him. Rourke found himself spinning, off balance, his forward motion redirected until he crashed face first into the side of his own patrol car. The sound of the impact echoed across the parking lot like a gunshot. Rourke's aviator sunglasses clattered to the asphalt as his face met the hot metal of the Crown Victoria's door. Before he could recover, Seagal had moved behind him, applying a precise hold that pinned the deputy against the vehicle without causing serious injury. Easy, Seagal said softly, his voice now directed at Deputy Vance, who had instinctively reached for her service weapon but hadn't drawn it. Nobody needs to get hurt here. Carla's hand hovered over her gun, her training warring with her conscience as she tried to process what she'd just witnessed. Her partner was pinned against their patrol car by a civilian, but that civilian had acted in defense of an innocent man who was being illegally arrested. Every instinct told her that Rourke had been wrong from the beginning, but he was still her partner, still a sworn officer. Let him go, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. In a moment, Seagal replied, maintaining his hold on Rourke while addressing the crowd that had begun to gather. Deputy Vance, you seem like a good officer. You know this was wrong. You know that man, he nodded toward Eli, didn't deserve to be humiliated and arrested for parking crooked. Rourke struggled against the hold, his face pressed against the warm metal of the patrol car. Get your hands off me, I'll have you, charged with assault on a police officer. Will you? Seagal asked mildly. Because I count at least 6 people recording this encounter, and I'm pretty sure the footage will show you attacking me first. Self-defense is still legal in Louisiana, last I checked. Indeed, phones were up throughout the parking lot and across the street. Maya and Theo were still live streaming, their follower count climbing as viewers shared the stream. Inside the diner, Loretta had captured the entire encounter, while Curtis was already composing the story in his head, his journalist instincts fully awakened. You want to know what real authority looks like? Seagal continued, his voice carrying clearly across the lot. It doesn't need to bully old men to prove itself. It doesn't arrest people for parking violations. It protects and serves, not intimidates and abuses. He released Rourke suddenly, stepping back with his hands visible. The deputy spun around, his face red with rage and embarrassment, his uniform disheveled. For a moment, it looked like he might reach for his weapon, but the presence of so many witnesses and cameras made him hesitate. This isn't over, Rourke snarled, trying to salvage some dignity from the situation. No, Seagal agreed quietly. It's not. Because now people have seen what happens when someone stands up to you. Now they know you're not invincible. He turned to Eli, who was still standing by his truck, watching the confrontation with wide eyes. You all right, sir? Eli nodded slowly, his voice hoarse with emotion. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Seagal nodded once, then looked directly at Deputy Vance. Officer, you took an oath to protect and serve. I think you know what the right thing to do here is. Carla Vance looked at her partner, then at the elderly veteran, then at the crowd of citizens who were no longer looking away, no longer staying silent. For the first time in months, she felt like she remembered why she'd wanted to be a police officer in the first place. Mr. Booker, she said formally, you're free to go. There are no charges. The words hung in the humid air like a thunderclap. Deputy Rourke Maddox stared at his partner in shock and betrayal, while the crowd began to murmur among themselves. Something had shifted in Cypress Hollow's carefully maintained balance of power, and everyone present could feel it. Steven Seagal walked back toward his motorcycle, his part in the drama seemingly finished. But as he swung his leg over the Harley, he paused and looked back at the assembled crowd. Sometimes, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the hut, all it takes is one person willing to stand up. The rest of you might be surprised what you're capable of. The motorcycle roared to life, but instead of leaving town, Seagal guided it toward the small motel on the edge of Main Street. He wasn't done with Cypress Hollow yet, and Cypress Hollow wasn't done with him. In the parking lot of Loretta's diner, the afternoon heat continued to press down like a weight, but the suffocating atmosphere of fear and silence had begun to lift. For the first time in years, the people of Cypress Hollow had seen someone stand up to Deputy Rourke Maddox and walk away. The question now was what they would do with that knowledge. The video went live at 4:17 p.m. Central Time. Maya Tran hit the share button on her TikTok livestream just as Steven Seagal's motorcycle disappeared around the corner toward the Cypress Inn. Within minutes, the footage of Deputy Rourke Maddox being pinned against his own patrol car was racing through the digital bloodstream of social media, gathering views and shares with the viral velocity that only comes from witnessing something genuinely shocking. Y'all seeing this? Maya spoke into her phone camera as she and her cousin Theo walked toward the diner. This is what just happened in Cypress Hollow, Louisiana. Deputy Maddox tried to arrest Mr. Eli for parking crooked, and this stranger just handled it. I ain't never seen nothing like this in my life. The notification chimes on her phone began almost immediately. Heart reactions, flame emojis, shares to Instagram stories and Twitter feeds. The algorithm had caught the scent of conflict and was pushing the video to feeds across the country. By 5 o'clock, it would have 50,000 views. By midnight, 500,000. Inside Loretta's diner, the atmosphere crackled with an energy that hadn't been felt in years. Conversations that had been whispered behind closed doors for decades suddenly erupted into open discussion as patrons processed what they'd just witnessed. Did you see how fast that man moved? Asked Betty Comeau, a retired school teacher, who'd watched 3 generations of Cypress Hollow children grow up, like he knew exactly what he was doing. Military, Curtis James said with certainty, closing his laptop after uploading Loretta's video to 3 different news outlets. Had to be. You don't move like that unless you've had serious training. Loretta herself stood behind the counter, her phone still in her hand, watching the view counter on her Facebook video climb steadily. She'd posted it with a simple caption, "Enough is enough. Time for this town to remember what's right." "Loretta," called Father Reggie from his corner booth, where he'd been nursing the same cup of coffee for 2 hours while wrestling with a sermon he couldn't quite write. "That was brave, what you did. Recording it, I mean." The diner owner looked at the elderly priest, a man she'd known since he'd arrived in Cypress Hollow 20 years ago, full of fire and conviction. Before, the weight of small-town politics had gradually worn him down to cautious whispers and diplomatic silences. "Should have done it years ago, Father," she replied, her voice carrying the weight of regret and newfound determination. "Should have done it the day they brought my boy home in a body bag, telling me he'd resisted arrest for the crime of being young and black and in the wrong place at the wrong time. The reference to her son Marcus hit the diner like a physical presence. 15 years had passed since the 20-year-old had died in custody, allegedly after attacking Deputy Rourke Maddox during a routine traffic stop. The official report had described it as a justified use of force, but everyone in Cypress Hollow knew Marcus Mayfield had been gentle as a summer rain, more likely to write poetry than throw a punch. Loretta, Father Reggie began, but she held up a hand. No, Father. No more keeping the peace and turning the other cheek. What I watched a stranger do what none of us have had the courage to do for years. Maybe it's time we stop being so afraid. Outside, Deputy Carla Vance sat in the patrol car while Rourke paced beside it, his face still flushed with rage and humiliation. The crowd had dispersed, but slowly, reluctantly, as if they were afraid that looking away might make the moment disappear like a mirage. You made me look like a fool out there, Rourke snarled at his partner, contradicting me in front of half the town. I ought to write you up for insubordination. Carla stared straight ahead through the windshield, her hands gripping the steering wheel. You were arresting an old man for parking crooked, Rourke, in an empty lot. What was I supposed to do? Your job, he snapped. Your job is to back me up, not second-guess every decision I make. My job, she said quietly, is to protect and serve, not to stand by while citizens are harassed and humiliated for no reason. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The words hung between them like a line drawn in the sand. Rourke stared at his partner, seeing something in her expression that he'd never noticed before. A backbone that wouldn't bend under pressure. A conscience that wouldn't be silenced. You better figure out whose side you're on, Vance, he said finally. Because Uncle Hank won't protect you if you keep undermining me. At the sheriff's office 12 miles outside town, Sheriff Hank Maddox was indeed getting his first calls about the incident. The phone rang constantly as concerned citizens, amateur journalists, and social media watchdogs demanded answers about Deputy Rourke Maddox's conduct. Each call made the sheriff's stomach sink a little lower. Hank had been sheriff of Beauregard Parish for 25 years, elected and re-elected on a platform of keeping the peace in a region where peace was often a scarce commodity. He'd watched his nephew grow from a hot-headed teenager into a hot-headed deputy, making excuses and covering for behavior that grew worse with each passing year. The incident at Loretta's diner was just the latest in the long line of complaints that had been quietly buried or explained away. But this time was different. This time there was video, lots of it spreading across the internet faster than kudzu in summer rain. This time there were witnesses who weren't intimidated into silence, and a mysterious stranger who'd made his nephew look weak and foolish in front of the entire town. Sheriff? Deputy Linda Thibodeau knocked on his office door, holding a stack of message slips. Channel 9 wants a statement about the incident in Cypress Hollow, so does the Times-Picayune, and someone from CNN called. CNN. Jesus Christ on a bicycle, CNN was calling about Cypress Hollow, Louisiana, population 847. Hank rubbed his temples where a headache was beginning to build. Tell them all no comment for now, he said wearily. And get Rourke on the radio. Tell him to come in. We need to talk. Back at the Cypress Inn, a modest motel that had seen better decades, Steven Seagal sat on the edge of the bed in room 7, watching the sun set through the window. His phone, an ancient flip model that looked like it belonged in a museum, sat silent on the nightstand. He had no social media accounts to monitor, no news alerts to ping him about his growing internet fame. He simply sat in meditation, breathing deeply, allowing the events of the day to settle in his mind like sediment in still water. There was a knock at his door, soft but insistent. When he opened it, he found Eli Booker standing in the humid evening air, his cane in one hand and a bottle of bourbon in the other. Mr. Eli began, realizing he didn't know the stranger's name. Seagal, Steven Seagal. Mr. Seagal, I wanted to thank you for what you did today. And I thought maybe you might join me for a drink. It's been a long time since I felt like celebrating anything in this town. Seagal considered the invitation, then stepped aside to let the older man enter. I don't drink, Mr. Booker, but I'd be honored to keep you company. As the two men settled into the motel room's worn chairs, Eli poured himself a modest measure of bourbon and raised the glass in a toast. To standing up, he said simply. To standing up, Seagal agreed, raising an imaginary glass of his own. Outside, Cypress Hollow settled into its evening routine, but with a difference that could be felt in the very air. Phones buzzed with notifications as the videos continued to spread. Conversations that had been whispered in kitchens for years moved to front porches and coffee shops. The town's carefully maintained silence was cracking like an eggshell, and something new was trying to hatch. At the sheriff's office, Hank Maddox stared at his computer screen, watching his nephew get humiliated over and over again as the video looped endlessly. Each replay made his stomach clench tighter, not just from embarrassment but from the dawning realization that the reckoning he'd been dreading for years had finally arrived. The phone rang again. Channel 12 this time. Then the Associated Press. Then someone claiming to be from a podcast called Corrupt Cops Exposed. The ripples were spreading wider and faster than anyone in Cypress Hollow had ever imagined possible. And somewhere in room 7 of the Cypress Inn, Steven Seagal listened to Eli Booker tell stories about better days, while the Louisiana night settled around them like a blanket, warm and full of possibility. By Thursday morning, the world had found Cypress Hollow. Sheriff Hank Maddox sat in emergency session with Parish Attorney General's Office Representative Janet Morrison, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who'd driven down from Baton Rouge at dawn with a briefcase full of questions and a mandate to contain what the state was calling a public relations disaster of significant proportions. Sheriff Maddox, Morrison said, setting her tablet on the conference table where the view count from yesterday's video scrolled past 2 million and climbing. We need to discuss your nephew's pattern of behavior and your department's response to civilian complaints. Hank's coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but he kept sipping it anyway, buying time while his world crumbled around him. The stack of incident reports Morrison had requested painted a picture he'd spent years trying to avoid seeing clearly. Traffic stops that escalated unnecessarily, use of force complaints that had been quietly dismissed, and a growing pattern of targeting elderly residents and minorities. Rourke's always been hot-headed, Hank admitted reluctantly, but he's family. I thought I could manage him, keep him in line. Manage him? Morrison's voice carried the sharp edge of someone who'd prosecuted dirty cops before. Mr. Booker wasn't the first elderly citizen your nephew has harassed. According to these reports, there have been 17 complaints against Deputy Maddox in the past 18 months alone. 17, Sheriff, and not one resulted in disciplinary action. Through the conference room window, Hank could see reporters setting up outside the sheriff's office. CNN had indeed sent a crew, along with local affiliates from New Orleans and Baton Rouge. A YouTuber with 500,000 subscribers had driven over from Lafayette with a camera crew, promising his audience an exclusive investigation into small-town police corruption. The state is opening a full investigation, Morrison continued. Deputy Maddox is suspended immediately pending review. We'll need all personnel files, all complaint records, and a full accounting of every use of force incident in the past 5 years. Janet, Hank said, using her first name in hopes of establishing some personal connection. This'll destroy him. Rourke's got a wife, kids. He's all the family I got left. Morrison's expression didn't soften. Sheriff, your nephew physically assaulted a senior citizen for a parking violation. If that mysterious stranger hadn't intervened, Mr. Booker would have been arrested and charged with crimes he didn't commit. How many other citizens has Deputy Maddox railroaded over the years? How many plea bargains to avoid his testimony? How many lives ruined because you chose family loyalty over justice? The questions hit like physical blows. Hank had asked himself the same things during the sleepless night, but hearing them spoken aloud by a state prosecutor made them real in a way that terrified him. Meanwhile, across town at the Sacred Heart Baptist Church, Father Reggie stood, at his pulpit preparing for what might be the most important sermon of his 20-year ministry. The church was fuller than it had been since Easter, word having spread through the community that their normally cautious pastor was finally going to address the elephant that had been sitting in their sanctuary for decades. Loretta Mayfield sat in the third pew, the same seat she'd occupied every Sunday since her son's funeral, her phone showing 847 comments on the video she'd posted. Most were supportive, some were angry, but all were engaged in a way that Cypress Hollow hadn't experienced in living memory. "Brothers and sisters," Father Reggie began, his voice stronger than it had been in years. "Yesterday we witnessed something that should shame us all. Not the actions of Deputy Maddox. We've seen those before, to our collective disgrace. No, what shames me is that it took a stranger passing through our town to do what we should have done years ago." Curtis James sat near the back, his laptop open, live tweeting the sermon to his growing followers. The former journalist had spent the night reaching out to old contacts, sharing the story with investigative reporters from major outlets who specialized in police misconduct. By morning, he'd received callback requests from the Washington Post, USA Today, and 60 Minutes. "We have hidden behind politeness and keeping the peace while our neighbors suffered," Father Reggie continued, his voice building with the passion that had once made him a powerful advocate for social justice. "We have chosen comfort over courage, silence over standing up for what's right. Yesterday, a stranger showed us what moral courage looks like. The question now is, what are we going to do with that lesson?" In the congregation, heads nodded that had stayed still for too long. Voices murmured agreement that had been silent for years. Maya and Theo sat with Maya's grandmother, watching their community begin to remember what it meant to have a backbone. At the Cypress Inn, Stephen Seagal sat in meditation on the small porch outside his room, seemingly oblivious to the media storm swirling around him. Reporters had tracked him down within hours, but he'd politely declined all interview requests, referring questions to the people of Cypress Hollow who have stories to tell. The refusal to seek attention or credit had only made the story more compelling. Social media was full of speculation about the mysterious stranger who'd appeared like a guardian angel, defended an innocent man, and then faded back into anonymity. Cypress Hollow stranger was trending nationally, spawning memes, conspiracy theories, and earnest discussions about the responsibility of bystanders to intervene. Deputy Carla Vance hadn't slept since the incident. She'd spent the night pacing her small apartment, wrestling with a decision that could end her law enforcement career before it really began. The body cam footage from the encounter was clear and damning. It showed exactly what everyone already knew, that her partner had been way out of line, and she had briefly found the courage to do the right thing. At 9 a.m., she made her choice. The sheriff's office was surrounded by media when she arrived, but she pushed through the crowd and walked directly to Sheriff Maddox's office, where he was still meeting with the state prosecutor. "Sheriff," she said, not waiting for permission to enter, "I need to speak with you about yesterday's incident." Morrison looked up from her files. "Deputy Vance, isn't it? You were Maddox's partner during the Booker incident." "Yes, ma'am, and I have body cam footage you need to see. Also, I have some things to say about Deputy Maddox's conduct that I should have reported months ago." The words came out in a rush, like water through a broken dam. Carla pulled her body cam from her belt and set it on the table, her hands shaking slightly as she spoke. "This footage shows the entire encounter from beginning to end. It shows that Mr. Booker committed no crime, offered no resistance, and was being illegally arrested for a parking violation that wouldn't even qualify as a citation. It also shows Deputy Maddox using excessive force and threatening both Mr. Booker and the civilian who intervened." Sheriff Maddox stared at his newest deputy, seeing his last hope of containing the scandal evaporating. "Carla, you don't have to do this. We can handle this internally, work something out." "No, Sheriff," she interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "I took an oath to protect and serve, not to cover up for officers who abuse their authority. I should have spoken up months ago when I saw how Deputy Maddox operates. I should have filed reports about the way he talks to citizens, the way he escalates situations unnecessarily. I was a coward, and yesterday an innocent man almost paid the price for my cowardice." Morrison was already taking notes, her legal mind cataloging the implications of a deputy willing to testify against her partner. "Deputy Vance, are you prepared to make an official statement about Deputy Maddox's conduct?" "Yes, ma'am. And I'm prepared to testify if this goes to court. The people of this community deserve better than what they've been getting." Outside, the crowd around the Sacred Heart Baptist Church was growing as Father Reggie's sermon ended, and word spread that people were finally ready to talk. Citizens who had been pulled over by Deputy Maddox, questioned without cause, or simply intimidated by his presence, began sharing their stories with anyone who would listen. Betty Como told reporters about the time Rourke had searched her car for 20 minutes after pulling her over for a broken taillight, looking for drugs he never found and treating her like a criminal for having the audacity to ask why. James Washington, a veteran who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan, described being handcuffed and held for 2 hours because Rourke claimed he'd been acting suspicious while waiting for his wife outside the grocery store. The stories poured out like a flood, years of suppressed anger and humiliation finally finding voice. Each testimony added another layer to the picture of systemic abuse that had been quietly poisoning Cypress Hollow for years. By noon, the hashtag #Cypress Hollow accountability was trending alongside #Cypress Hollow Stranger, and the story had evolved from a simple viral video to a broader conversation about police accountability in small-town America. Deputy Rourke Maddox, meanwhile, sat in his kitchen drinking beer and watching his world burn on live television. His wife had taken the kids to her mother's house in Alexandria, unwilling to face the reporters camping outside their home. His uncle was meeting with state prosecutors. His partner had apparently grown a conscience overnight. And somewhere, in town, a mysterious stranger was being hailed as a hero for making him look like a fool. The phone rang. It was a reporter from the Times-Picayune wanting a statement. He didn't answer. It rang again. CNN this time. Then Fox News. Then someone, claiming to be from a Netflix documentary crew. Rourke turned off the phone and opened another beer. Outside, Louisiana was having a conversation about justice and accountability and the abuse of power. Inside, a small, angry man was learning what it felt like to be powerless for the first time in his adult life. The reckoning that Sheriff Hank Maddox had been dreading for years had finally arrived, brought not by internal investigations or citizen complaints, but by a stranger on a motorcycle who'd simply refused to let injustice slide by unnoticed. As the afternoon heat pressed down on Cypress Hollow, the town was discovering something it had forgotten. That silence in the face of injustice was itself a form of violence, and that sometimes the most radical act was simply speaking the truth out loud. The Louisiana night hung thick and oppressive over Cypress Hollow, Spanish moss swaying in the humid breeze like ghostly curtains in the darkness. Most of the media circus had departed with the setting sun, reporters retreating to hotels in Lafayette and Lake Charles to file their stories and prepare for tomorrow's follow-up coverage. But the energy of change still crackled through the air, conversations continuing on front porches and in kitchen windows where people stayed up late processing what they'd witnessed. Stephen Seagal walked alone along the old levee road that ran beside Bayou Teche, his footsteps silent on the packed earth despite the darkness. He moved with the fluid grace of someone comfortable in any environment, his senses attuned to the night sounds of the Louisiana wetlands, the splash of a nutria sliding into dark water, the distant call of a night heron, the rustle of something larger moving through the cypress trees. He hadn't sought solitude to hide from the attention, but rather to find the quiet space where truth lived, away from the noise and fury of human drama. In his philosophy, influenced by decades of martial arts study and spiritual seeking, real change happened not in the spotlight but in the dark, quiet moments where people decided who they wanted to be. The sound of footsteps behind him was deliberate, heavy, meant to be heard. Seagal didn't turn around immediately, instead pausing beside a massive cypress tree whose roots disappeared into the black water of the bayou. He'd been expecting this confrontation since the moment he'd pinned Deputy Rourke Maddox against the patrol car. "You think you're real smart, don't you?" Rourke's voice carried through the darkness, slurred slightly with alcohol and thick with rage. "Coming into my town making me look like a fool in front of everybody." Seagal turned slowly, his movements calm and deliberate. Deputy Maddox stood about 15 feet away, still in uniform but disheveled, his badge catching moonlight that filtered through the moss-draped branches. His service weapon remained holstered, but his hand rested on the grip in a gesture that was part threat, part reassurance to himself. "Your town?" Seagal asked quietly, his voice carrying clearly across the still night air. "That's interesting. I thought it belonged to the people who live here, work here, raise their families here. People like Mr. Booker." "Don't you dare lecture me about this town," Rourke snarled, taking a step closer. "I was born here. My family's been keeping the peace here for 30 years. You're just some drifter who rolled in yesterday thinking he knows everything." Seagal remained perfectly still, his hands visible and empty, but his posture conveyed the coiled readiness of a man who'd faced violence countless times and survived. "Keeping the peace," he repeated thoughtfully. "Is that what you call terrorizing? Senior citizens? Arresting people for parking violations? Making families afraid to call for help when they need it?" The words hit like physical blows, each one targeting the carefully constructed justifications Rourke had built around his behavior over the years. He'd always told himself he was maintaining order, keeping criminals in line, showing strength that prevented bigger problems. Having those rationalizations stripped away by a stranger who'd known him for less than 24 hours was unbearable. "You don't know what it's like," Rourke said, his voice rising with desperation and fury. "Dealing with the dregs of society, every day. Junkies and thieves and troublemakers who don't respect authority. Sometimes you have to show them who's in charge." "And Mr. Booker?" Seagal asked, taking a single step forward. 78 years old, Navy veteran, never been arrested, comes to the same diner for 20 years to drink tea and talk with friends. Which category did he fall into? Rourke's face contorted with rage. The question exposed the fundamental emptiness at the core of his philosophy. The fact that his need to dominate and control had nothing to do with law enforcement and everything to do with his own insecurities and failures. "He was resisting," Rourke shouted, though even he didn't believe it. He was, and he was acting suspicious. He was standing by his truck, holding his cane, trying to apologize for parking crooked. Seagal replied, his voice still calm but carrying an undertone of steel. "And you saw an opportunity to feel powerful at the expense of someone who couldn't fight back." The truth hung in the humid air between them like a living thing. Rourke's hand tightened on his weapon, not really intending to draw it but needing the comfort of its presence. He'd built his entire adult identity around the idea that his badge made him special, that his authority was absolute, that people's fear was actually respect. "You humiliated me," he said, his voice cracking slightly with the weight of his shattered self-image. "In front of the whole town. Do you have any idea what that's done to me? To my family?" For the first time, Seagal's expression softened slightly, showing not pity but a deeper understanding of the human condition. "I didn't humiliate you, Deputy. I just gave you an opportunity to show your true character. You chose how to respond." "I should arrest you right now," Rourke threatened, though they both knew how empty the threat was. Assault on a police officer, interfering with an investigation. "You could try," Seagal agreed calmly, "but we both know what really happened yesterday. And more importantly, so does everyone else. The videos don't lie, Deputy. They show exactly who you are and who you choose to be." A great blue heron called from somewhere across the dark water, its voice echoing through the cypress trees like a judgment from the natural world. The sound seemed to deflate some of Rourke's rage, replacing it with something closer to despair. "What am I supposed to do now?" he asked, the question torn from somewhere deep inside. "This job is all I know. It's all I am." "Maybe that's the problem," Seagal replied gently. "Maybe being a police officer should be what you do, not who you are. Maybe the badge should serve something bigger than your ego." The words carried the weight of wisdom earned through experience, through years of examining his own relationship with power and violence. Seagal had walked similar paths in different contexts, had faced the choice between using strength to dominate or to protect? It's too late, Rourke said, his voice hollow with defeat. They're going to fire me, prosecute me. My wife's already talking about taking the kids and leaving. 20 years on this job and it's all gone because of one old man and his parking. It's not gone because of Mr. Booker, Seagal said, his voice carrying a compassion that surprised them both. It's gone because of choices you made every day for years. Every time you chose intimidation over de-escalation. Every time you chose power over service. Every time you forgot that your job was to protect people, not control them. Rourke's shoulders sagged as the full weight of his situation settled over him. The anger was draining away, leaving behind only the hollow awareness that he'd destroyed his own life through his inability to see citizens as human beings worthy of respect. "What would you do?" he asked, the question barely audible above the night sounds of the bayou. "If you were me?" Seagal considered the question seriously, understanding that this moment could define not just Rourke's future, but potentially influence how he approached the rest of his life. "I'd start by apologizing," he said finally. "Really apologizing. Not just sorry I got caught apologizing. I'd acknowledge the harm I'd caused and try to make amends where possible. I'd get help. Therapy. Anger management. Whatever it took to understand why I needed to hurt people to feel good about myself. And then I'd find a way to serve that didn't involve a badge and a gun. Maybe work with veterans like Mr. Booker. Maybe coach youth sports. Maybe just be a decent neighbor. There are a lot of ways to make the world better that don't require authority over other people." The silence stretched between them, filled with the sounds of night creatures and the gentle lap of bayou water against the cypress roots. Somewhere, in the distance, a boat motor puttered slowly through the darkness, probably a fisherman heading out for an early morning on the water. "You still think I have a choice?" Rourke asked eventually. "Everyone always has a choice," Seagal replied. "Right up until they don't. The question is whether you'll make better ones going forward, or keep doubling down on the ones that brought you here." Another silence, longer this time. When Rourke finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that went deeper than physical, exhaustion. "I don't know how to be anything else," he admitted. "I don't know how to be the kind of man who doesn't need to make other people afraid." "Then learn," Seagal said simply. "It's never too late to become the person you should have been all along." With that, he turned and began walking back toward town, leaving Deputy Rourke Maddox alone with the darkness in his conscience. Behind him, he heard the sound of a man crying for the first time in 20 years, the broken sobs of someone finally seeing himself clearly and not liking what he found. The bayou absorbed the sound without judgment, as it had absorbed countless human dramas over the centuries. In its dark waters, secrets were kept and sins were washed away, but redemption, that was something each person had to find for themselves. As Seagal disappeared into the Spanish moss shadows, Rourke Maddox sat down heavily on a fallen cypress log and stared out at the black water, beginning the long, difficult process of deciding who he wanted to be for the rest of his life. By Friday morning, Cypress Hollow had become the center of a national conversation about police accountability and small-town justice. What had started as a simple viral video had evolved into something much larger, a case study in how one moment of moral courage could ignite long-suppressed community outrage and demand for change. Deputy Carla Vance sat in her car outside the sheriff's office at dawn, watching news vans from CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News set up their equipment in the parking lot. Her resignation letter lay on the passenger seat beside her, carefully typed and printed on official letterhead. She'd spent the sleepless night composing it, knowing that the words she was about to speak would end her law enforcement career, but finally allow her to sleep with a clear conscience. The body cam footage she'd turned over to the state investigators was already making headlines. Unlike the cell phone videos that had sparked the initial outrage, her official recording captured audio of Rourke's threats, his verbal abuse of Eli Booker, and his complete disregard for proper police procedure. Combined with her willingness to testify about his pattern of behavior, it had transformed what might have been a single incident into evidence of systemic corruption. "Deputy Vance?" A young reporter from the Times-Picayune approached her car as she gathered her courage. "I'm Sarah Chen. I was wondering if you might be willing to speak about Deputy Maddox's conduct and the culture in the sheriff's department." Carla looked at the reporter through her window, seeing someone not much older than herself, probably fresh out of journalism school and hungry for the kind of story that could make a career. She rolled down the window halfway. "I'll be making a statement in a few minutes," she said. "You'll want to record it." Inside the sheriff's office, Hank Maddox was discovering what it felt like to watch a legacy crumble in real time. The state investigators had taken over his conference room, spreading files and evidence across every available surface. Deputy Maddox's personnel file lay open, revealing a pattern of complaints, use of force incidents, and disciplinary actions that painted a picture of an officer out of control and a supervisor unwilling to act. "Sheriff?" Janet Morrison looked up from a stack of incident reports. "We've identified 43 separate complaints against Deputy Maddox over the past 5 years. 43. And according to these files, not one resulted in suspension, demotion, or mandatory retraining." Hank slumped in his chair, feeling every one of his 62 years pressing down on him like physical weight. "He's family, Janet. I thought I could handle it internally. Keep him in line." "Handle it internally," Morrison repeated, her voice carrying the sharp edge of prosecutorial contempt. "Is that what you told the Henderson family when their 16-year-old son was hospitalized after Deputy Maddox subdued him for riding his bicycle through a neighborhood where someone had reported suspicious activity?" The Henderson case had been one of Hank's deepest shames. An incident where Rourke had tackled a black teenager off his bike and tased him twice while he lay on the ground, claiming the boy had been resisting arrest for the crime of riding through a predominantly white neighborhood. The family had wanted to press charges, but community pressure and a quiet settlement had made the problem disappear. Or so Hank had thought. "Tommy Henderson has permanent nerve damage in his left arm," Morrison continued relentlessly. "His family accepted a settlement of $50,000 in exchange for not filing a federal civil rights lawsuit. How many other families have you paid off to keep your nephew's misconduct quiet?" Before Hank could answer, Deputy Vance appeared in the doorway, her resignation letter in one hand and her badge in the other. "Sheriff," she said formally, "I need to speak with you and Ms. Morrison." She entered without waiting for permission, setting her badge on the conference table with a metallic clink that seemed to echo through the room. "I'm resigning from the Beauregard Parish Sheriff's Department effective immediately," she announced, handing the letter to Hank. "I can no longer serve in an organization that tolerates the systematic abuse of citizens by officers who view their badge as a license to intimidate and assault." Hank stared at the resignation letter, the words blurring as he realized he was losing the only deputy who'd shown any integrity in the entire mess. "Carla, you don't have to do this," he pleaded. "We can transfer you to another unit. Get you away from Rourke. You're a good officer." "I was a coward, Sheriff," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotion underlying it. "I stood by and watched Deputy Maddox abuse his authority for months because I was afraid of losing my job. It took a civilian, a stranger passing through town, to show me what moral courage actually looks like." Morrison was already taking notes, recognizing the value of having an insider willing to testify about departmental culture. "Deputy Vance, would you be willing to provide a detailed statement about Deputy Maddox's conduct and any instances where you witnessed misconduct?" "Yes, ma'am, and I have something else you need to see." Carla pulled out her phone and opened the voice memo app. "I've been recording Deputy Maddox during our shifts for the past month, documenting his interactions with citizens. I originally planned to use it to protect myself if he tried to blame me for something, but now I think it's more important that the truth comes out." She played a selection of recordings that painted a damning picture of Rourke's mindset and methods. His voice came through clearly, threatening citizens, using racial slurs when he thought no one was listening, and bragging about teaching people lessons through intimidation and excessive force. "Jesus Christ," Hank whispered, hearing his nephew's voice confirm everything he'd suspected but refused to acknowledge. "Rourke, what have you done?" Outside, the media presence was growing by the hour. Curtis James had set up a makeshift press area in the parking lot of Loretta's diner, using his journalist contacts to coordinate interviews with citizens who were finally ready to tell their stories. The atmosphere was electric with the energy of people who'd been silent too long suddenly finding their voices. "This is about more than one bad cop," Curtis explained to a CNN reporter, his laptop open to show a spreadsheet he'd compiled of complaints, incidents, and patterns of abuse. "This is about a system that protected misconduct, a community that stayed silent out of fear, and a culture that allowed authority to be abused without consequences." Loretta Mayfield stood beside her diner's entrance, greeting reporters and directing them towards citizens who'd agreed to speak on camera. For the first time since her son's death 15 years ago, she felt like justice might actually be possible. Marcus was 20 years old, she told Anderson Cooper in an interview that would air that evening. Gentle as summer rain wouldn't hurt a fly, but Deputy Maddox's report said he attacked an officer, tried to grab his gun. Anyone who knew my boy knew that was impossible, but who was going to challenge a police report? Who was going to call a deputy a liar? The interview was powerful, heartbreaking, and impossible to dismiss. When it aired at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, Justice for Marcus began trending alongside their Cypress Hollow accountability, and suddenly the story wasn't just about one confrontation but about decades of injustice that had been hidden in plain sight. At the Sacred Heart Baptist Church, Father Reggie was preparing for an evening service that would be unlike anything in his 20-year ministry. Word had spread through the community that citizens were gathering to share their experiences, to bear witness to years of fear and intimidation, and to begin the process of healing that could only come through truth-telling. The church was packed beyond capacity, with people standing in the aisles and spilling out onto the front steps. Maya and Theo live-streamed the service to their growing social media following, providing real-time documentation of the community's awakening. "We gather tonight not for revenge," Father Reggie began, his voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary, "but for truth. For too long, we have chosen silence over justice, comfort over courage. We have allowed fear to keep us from speaking up for our neighbors, our friends, our children." One by one, citizens rose to share their stories. Betty Comeau described being humiliated during a traffic stop that lasted 2 hours, while Deputy Maddox searched her car for drugs that didn't exist. James Washington talked about being handcuffed and detained for acting suspicious while waiting for his wife outside the grocery store. A teenage girl named Ashley Tran, Maya's younger sister, tearfully recounted being threatened with arrest for smart-mouthing when she'd asked why she was being questioned for walking home from school. Each testimony added another layer to the picture of systematic intimidation that had poisoned Cypress Hollow's relationship with law enforcement. The stories poured out like floodwater, years of suppressed anger and humiliation finally finding voice in the safety of the church sanctuary. But the most powerful moment came when Eli Booker himself rose from his seat in the third pew. The elderly veteran had been reluctant to speak publicly, preferring to let others tell their stories. But as he listened to testimony after testimony, he realized that his voice carried particular weight as the catalyst for the community's awakening. "I served my country for 4 years in Vietnam," he said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the packed church. "I came home to build a life in this community, to raise my children here, to grow old in peace. For most of that time, Cypress Hollow was the kind of place where neighbors looked out for each other, where respect was mutual, where the law was meant to protect everyone equally." He paused, gathering his thoughts and his courage. "What happened to me on Tuesday wasn't unusual. It was just the first time someone was brave enough to step in and stop it. How many times have we all watched injustice happen and turned away? How many times have we told ourselves it wasn't our business, wasn't our problem? How many people suffered because we chose silence over solidarity?" The questions hung in the air like a challenge. Around the sanctuary, heads nodded in recognition and shame. The community was being forced to confront not just Deputy Maddox's misconduct, but their own complicity in allowing it to continue. "Yesterday, a stranger showed us what courage looks like," Eli continued. He didn't know me, didn't owe me anything, had nothing to gain by getting involved. But he saw injustice and chose to act. The question now is, what are we going to do with the example he set? As if summoned by the mention, Stephen Seagal appeared quietly in the back of the church, having slipped in during Eli's testimony. He didn't seek attention or recognition, simply stood among the crowd and listened as a community found its voice. The service continued past midnight, with person after person rising to speak, to witness, to finally tell truths that had been hidden for too long. When it finally ended, the people of Cypress Hollow emerged into the humid Louisiana night, knowing that their town would never be the same. The fire of accountability had been lit, and there was no putting it out. 3 weeks after the confrontation, that changed everything, Cypress Hollow was still processing the earthquake that had shaken its foundations. The media circus had largely moved on to other stories, but the real work of rebuilding trust and accountability was just beginning. Deputy Rourke Maddox sat in his lawyer's office in Lafayette, signing papers that would end his law enforcement career forever. The plea agreement laid out on the mahogany desk represented the collapse of everything he'd built his identity around. His badge, his authority, his belief that fear equaled respect. In exchange for pleading guilty to civil rights violations and assault charges, he would serve 18 months in federal prison and be permanently barred from working in law enforcement. "You're getting off easy," his attorney, Marcus Broussard, said bluntly. With the video evidence and Deputy Vance's testimony, they could have pushed for 5 years minimum. The fact that you're showing genuine remorse and agreeing to testify against the department's culture of misconduct is the only thing saving you. Rourke's wife had filed for divorce the previous week, taking their 2 young children to live with her sister in Texas. The house they'd shared for 8 years was already on the market, another casualty of choices that had seemed so justified at the time but looked monstrous in hindsight. "What happens to Uncle Hank?" Rourke asked, though he already knew the answer. Sheriff Maddox announced his retirement yesterday, effective immediately, the state's taking over the department pending a complete reorganization. Broussard shuffled, through more papers. "Honestly, Rourke, your uncle's lucky he's not facing charges himself. 25 years of looking the other way, covering up complaints, protecting you from consequences, that's criminal negligence at minimum." Across town at the Sacred Heart Baptist Church, a very different kind of meeting was taking place. The newly formed Cypress Hollow Citizens Accountability Committee had grown from a dozen concerned residents to over 100 people committed to ensuring that the changes happening in their community would be permanent and meaningful. Carla Vance stood at the front of the church hall, no longer wearing a uniform but still carrying herself with the bearing of someone committed to service. She'd been offered a position with the state police but had instead chosen to stay in Cypress Hollow to help design the new community policing model that would replace the old system. "The federal consent decree requires comprehensive reform," she explained to the gathered citizens. "New hiring practices, mandatory de-escalation training, body cameras for all officers, and most importantly, a civilian oversight board with real authority to investigate complaints and recommend discipline." Loretta Mayfield raised her hand. From the third row. "What about the officers who knew what was happening and stayed silent? Are they just going to keep their jobs like nothing happened?" "That's up to the community," Carla replied. "The consent decree requires retraining for all existing officers, psychological evaluations, and ongoing monitoring. But ultimately, you'll have a voice in who serves you. That's what accountability looks like." Curtis James, now serving as the committee's secretary, was documenting everything for the series of articles he was writing for the Washington Post. The former journalist had found his calling again, but this time as an advocate rather than just an observer. "We're not just reforming the police department," he said, addressing the crowd. "We're reclaiming our community. We're saying that silence in the face of injustice is complicity, and we won't be complicit anymore." Maya and Theo had become unlikely activists, their social media presence growing to include teenagers from across the South who'd been inspired by their courage to document and share their own experiences with police misconduct. Their TikTok account, Hollow Truth, had over 500,000 followers and had sparked similar accountability movements in small towns across Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Change doesn't just happen, Maya said in a video that would go viral later that week. It takes people willing to stand up, speak out, and make their voices heard. It takes courage to say, enough is enough, and mean it. Father Reggie had found his voice again after years of cautious silence. His sermons had become powerful calls for justice and community healing, drawing visitors from across the region who came to hear a message of hope and accountability that had been missing from too many pulpits for too long. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, he preached to a packed sanctuary. It doesn't mean ignoring injustice or pretending harm didn't happen. True forgiveness requires acknowledgement, accountability, and a commitment to do better. That's what we're building here in Cypress Hollow. The state had appointed an interim sheriff, Captain Maria Santos, a 20-year veteran from the Louisiana State Police, with a reputation for integrity and community engagement. Her first act had been to meet with every citizen who'd filed a complaint against the previous administration, listening to their stories and apologizing for the failures that had allowed their suffering to continue. Trust is earned, she told the packed town hall meeting that followed her appointment. And earning your trust is going to be my priority every single day. We're not just changing policies, we're changing culture. We're remembering that we work for you, not the other way around. The memorial service for Marcus Mayfield, held 15 years after his death but finally acknowledging the injustice of his loss, had drawn hundreds of people from across the parish. Loretta had stood at the podium, her voice strong and clear as she spoke about her son's life and the long journey toward justice. Marcus can't come back, she said, her words carrying across the packed church. But his death won't be meaningless if it helps us build a community where every citizen is treated with dignity and respect, where parents don't have to fear for their children's safety when they encounter law enforcement, where justice isn't just a word painted on the side of a police car. The afternoon sun streamed through the stained glass windows as the community came together to honor not just Marcus, but all the victims of systemic injustice who'd suffered in silence for too long. It was a moment of healing that had been decades in the making, painful but necessary for the work of rebuilding trust to begin. As evening approached, the people of Cypress Hollow dispersed to their homes, but with a different energy than they'd carried for years. The fear that had kept them silent was being replaced by something more powerful, the knowledge that their voices mattered, that justice was possible, and that standing together was stronger than staying silent alone. The golden hour light filtered through the Spanish moss as Steven Seagal sat on the porch of Loretta's diner, sharing a final cup of tea with Eli Booker. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation that changed everything, and the mysterious stranger who'd sparked a revolution was preparing to disappear as quietly as he'd arrived. "You know they're calling you a hero," Eli said, his weathered hands wrapped around his glass of sweet tea. "That CNN reporter asked me yesterday if I knew how to reach you. Said they wanted to do a follow-up story." Seagal smiled slightly, his eyes focused on the horizon where the setting sun painted the bayou in shades of amber and gold. "Heroes don't need credit, Mr. Booker. They just need to know they did the right thing when it mattered." The old Harley-Davidson sat in the diner's parking lot, loaded with the few possessions Seagal carried on his journey. A bedroll, a change of clothes, and a small wooden box containing items of sentimental value. A medal from his father, a photo of his mother, a stone from a beach in Okinawa, where he'd learned that true strength came from protecting the weak, not dominating them. "Where will you go?" Eli asked, though he suspected the answer would be as mysterious as the man himself. "Where I'm needed," Seagal replied simply. "There are a lot of places where people have forgotten how to stand up for what's right. Maybe seeing what happened here will help them remember." Loretta emerged from the diner carrying a paper bag that smelled of fresh biscuits and homemade preserves. She'd been trying to pay for Seagal's meals all week, but he'd insisted on covering his own tab, leaving generous tips that had made her tear up with gratitude. "You take this for the road," she said, pressing the bag into his hands. "And you, remember that you've got family here in Cypress Hollow if you ever need it." Seagal accepted the gift with a bow of his head, understanding that the food was less important than the gesture, a community's way of saying thank you to someone who'd shown them what courage looked like. "Mrs. Mayfield," he said formally, "what you did, recording that video, standing up in court, organizing the community, that took more courage than anything I did. You're the real hero in this story." Loretta's eyes filled with tears as she thought about her son Marcus, about the 15 years of silence that had followed his death, about the fear that had kept her from speaking truth to power. "I should have done it sooner," she whispered. "You did it when you were ready," Seagal replied gently. "That's what matters. And now other mothers won't have to lose their sons to prove that every life has value." Curtis James approached from across the street, his laptop bag slung over his shoulder. The former journalist had spent the afternoon interviewing state officials about the consent decree that would govern Cypress Hollow's police reform, but he'd wanted to say goodbye to the man who'd made it all possible. "The Washington Post wants to do a feature story," he said, extending his hand to Seagal, "about the stranger who sparked a movement. They're calling it the Cypress Hollow effect. Small towns across the South are forming accountability committees, demanding body cameras, questioning authority they used to accept without question." Seagal shook the offered hand, his grip firm but gentle. "Tell them to focus on the people who stayed to do the work, the ones who'll be here tomorrow and next year and 10 years from now, making sure the changes stick. That's the real story." As if summoned by their conversation, Maya and Theo appeared with their phones, but not to record this time. Simply to be present for a moment they understood was significant. The teenagers had become minor celebrities, their hollow truth, platform inspiring young people across the region to document and share their own experiences with injustice. "Mr. Seagal," Maya said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd found her purpose. "Thank you for showing us that one person can make a difference. We're not going to let this momentum die." "The momentum was always there," Seagal replied, looking at the young woman who'd captured the original video. "You just needed someone to help you remember how to use it." Father Reggie arrived just as the sun was touching the horizon, his steps quickened by the knowledge that their mysterious guardian was leaving. The priest had found his voice again. In the weeks since the confrontation, his sermons drawing visitors from across the region who came to hear a message of justice and redemption. "I wanted to thank you," he said, slightly out of breath from hurrying. "Not just for what you did, but for reminding me what moral courage looks like. I'd forgotten somewhere along the way." "You never forgot," Seagal corrected gently. "You just needed the right moment to remember." Carla Vance was the last to arrive, still wearing civilian clothes but carrying herself with the bearing of someone who'd found her true calling. She'd been offered positions with state and federal law enforcement agencies, but had chosen to stay in Cypress Hollow to help build something better from the ground up. "The new sheriff wants to meet you," she said, shaking Seagal's hand. "Captain Santos, she's good people. She wants to thank you for what you started here." "What I started?" Seagal smiled, gathering his jacket from the porch railing. "I just reminded people of something they already knew. The real work, the hard work of rebuilding trust and accountability. That's what all of you are doing." He walked to his motorcycle, the small group following as he prepared for departure. The Harley started with its familiar rumble, the sound that had announced his arrival 3 weeks ago now marking his departure. "Will we see you again?" Eli asked, raising his voice over the engine noise. Seagal considered the question seriously before answering. "You'll see me whenever you look in the mirror and remember that you have the power to stand up for what's right. Whenever you choose courage over comfort, justice over silence, I'll be there." With that, he guided the motorcycle onto Main Street, heading toward Highway 90 and whatever destination awaited him. The small group stood in the diner's parking lot, watching until his taillights disappeared into the gathering dusk. "He's really gone," Maya said, her voice carrying a mixture of sadness and wonder. "No," Eli replied, his hand resting on his carved cypress cane. "He's not gone. He's just become part of the story we tell ourselves about who we are and who we can be." As full darkness settled over Cypress Hollow, The Spanish moss swayed in the humid breeze, and somewhere in the bayou, a night heron called across the dark water. The town settled into its evening rhythm, but with a different energy than it had carried for years. The energy of a community that had remembered its own strength and wasn't about to forget it again. 6 months after a stranger on a motorcycle changed everything, Cypress Hollow was unrecognizable from the town that had once lived in fear of its own police force. The morning sun filtered through Spanish moss onto Main Street, illuminating a community that had learned to stand tall again. Sheriff Maria Santos stood in the doorway of the renovated police station, watching as the last of the new body cameras were installed in the patrol cars. The federal consent decree had mandated comprehensive reform, but the changes went deeper than policy. They reached into the soul of how law enforcement related to the community it served. Sheriff Santos? Officer Jennifer Kim approached, her crisp uniform bearing the new department patches that emphasized community partnership over law enforcement. Kim was one of 6 new officers hired specifically for their backgrounds in community policing and de-escalation techniques. The Accountability Committee meeting is at 10, Kim reported. They want to review the monthly use of force statistics and discuss the new youth outreach program. Santos nodded, still amazed by the transformation. In her 20 years of law enforcement, she'd never seen a community so actively engaged in police oversight. The Cypress Hollow Citizens Accountability Committee had become a model for other small towns. Its monthly meetings packed with residents who understood that democracy required participation, not just complaints. Across town at the Sacred Heart Baptist Church, Father Reggie was putting the finishing touches on his sermon, titled The Courage to Continue. The church had become a regional destination, drawing visitors who came to hear a gospel of justice and redemption that had been too long absent from many pulpits. The real miracle, he would tell his congregation, isn't that one man had the courage to stand up. It's that his courage reminded all of us that we had the same power inside ourselves all along. At Loretta's diner, the morning rush was in full swing, but with a different energy than the fearful whispers that had once characterized conversations about law enforcement. Customers openly discussed the latest police department innovations, shared stories of positive interactions with officers, and celebrated the fact that their children no longer feared seeing patrol cars in their neighborhoods. "Mr. Eli's coming. In for lunch," Loretta announced to her staff, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who'd learned that speaking truth to power didn't cost her everything. It had given her everything back. Eli Booker had become something of a local celebrity, his dignity during the confrontation and his gracious response to the aftermath making him a symbol of the community's resilience. But he wore the attention lightly, preferring to focus on his work with the Veterans Advisory Council that now met monthly at the church. Every Tuesday at 2, he told visitors who came to hear his story, "We help veterans navigate the system, connect with services, and remember that service to country doesn't end when the uniform comes off." Maya and Theo had parlayed their social media success into a real platform for change. Their Hollow Truth podcast now reached hundreds of thousands of listeners, inspiring young people across the South to document injustice and demand accountability in their own communities. The Cypress Hollow effect had become a recognized phenomenon, studied by criminologists and social scientists, as an example of how community organizing could create lasting institutional change. But for Maya, the real success was measured in smaller moments. "My little sister Ashley walked home from school yesterday," she told her podcast audience. "Just walked home, regular as anything, without looking over her shoulder or worrying about being stopped and questioned. That's what change looks like, when normal teenage stuff becomes normal again." Curtis James had returned to journalism with a vengeance, his series on police accountability winning a Pulitzer Prize nomination and leading to a book deal. But his real pride was in the community forum he'd established, where citizens could share concerns and suggestions with local government in a transparent public setting. "Democracy isn't a spectator sport," he reminded forum participants. "It requires all of us to stay engaged, to ask questions, to hold our leaders accountable. That's not somebody else's job. It's everybody's job." The former deputies who'd served under the old regime had faced various fates. Some had genuinely embraced the reform process, undergoing extensive retraining and psychological evaluation to address the toxic culture they'd been part of. Others had quietly resigned, unable or unwilling to adapt to a system that valued de-escalation over dominance. Carla Vance had become the department's community liaison, working directly with the Accountability Committee to address concerns and ensure transparency. Her courage in speaking out had made her a regional hero, but she deflected praise toward the citizens who'd found their voices. "I did what I should have done from the beginning," she told a conference of police reform advocates. "The real heroes are the people who live here, who decided they deserved better and were willing to work for it." Deputy Rourke Maddox had served his sentence and been released from federal prison 3 months ago. He'd moved to a small town in Arkansas, where he worked at a veterans rehabilitation center, helping former soldiers readjust to civilian life. The work was humble, unglamorous, and healing in ways he'd never expected. "I can't undo the harm I caused," he'd written in a letter to the Cypress Hollow Gazette, published on the 6-month anniversary of his arrest. "But I can spend the rest of my life trying to make amends. Every day I work with veterans who've sacrificed. For their country, I remember what service actually means. I forgot that for too long, and good people suffered because of my failures." The letter had sparked heated debate in the community. Some saw it as genuine remorse, others as manipulation. But the discussion itself was healthy, evidence of a community confident enough in its own strength to grapple with difficult questions of justice, forgiveness, and redemption. Sheriff Hank Maddox had retired to his fishing cabin on Bayou Teche, where he spent his days in quiet contemplation of the legacy he'd left behind. The man who'd once been the most powerful figure in the parish now lived in obscurity, his reputation forever tainted by his failure to act when action was needed most. As evening approached, Cypress Hollow settled into its familiar rhythms, but with a difference that could be felt in the very air. Children played in yards without fear, neighbors gathered on porches to discuss community affairs, and the Spanish moss swayed in the humid breeze over a town that had remembered its own strength. The Cypress Inn still operated, its guest registry showing a steady stream of visitors, journalists, researchers, reformers, and ordinary citizens who came to see what accountability looked like in action. Room 7, where Stephen Seagal had stayed, was often requested by guests who wanted to connect with the history of change. "Sometimes the strongest voices don't shout," read the plaque that now hung outside Loretta's diner, a gift from the Accountability Committee. "They simply act." And Cypress Hollow finally listened. The plague bore no attribution, but everyone knew its source. The mysterious stranger who'd appeared like a guardian angel, defended an innocent man, and disappeared back into the American landscape. He'd left no forwarding address, no contact information, no way to reach him. But his influence lived on in every conversation about justice, every moment of moral courage, every choice to stand up rather than stay silent. As the sun set over the bayou, painting the Spanish moss in shades of gold and crimson, Cypress Hollow prepared for another night of peaceful sleep. For the first time in decades, it was a community at peace with itself, secure in the knowledge that justice wasn't just an ideal painted on the side of a police car. It was a living principle, practiced daily by ordinary people who'd learned that courage was contagious and change was possible. Somewhere out there, a man on a motorcycle was riding toward another town, another injustice, another moment when someone would need to remember that one person could make a difference. But in Cypress Hollow, Louisiana, the lesson had been learned and the change had taken root. The stranger was gone, but his legacy lived on in every citizen who'd found their voice, every reform that protected the vulnerable, every moment when someone chose to stand up for what was right. That was the real miracle. Not that one man had been brave, but that his bravery had reminded an entire community that they were brave too. Cypress Hollow had risen, and it would not fall again. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.